All right, we are now recording. This is the transportation kickoff for the district's carbon neutrality strategy on Tuesday, September 22nd at 10 a.m. Over to you, Kate.
I guess I should start by unmuting myself. Thanks so much, Jen, and good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Johnson. I'm the chief of the Green Building and Climate Branch at the Department of Energy and Environment. And our team is working on the carbon neutrality strategy, which you'll learn more about today. I want to start with a couple acknowledgements before we dive into the content. I think first I want to acknowledge that we would love to have this conversation with you all in person. We know that COVID-19 has upended a lot of people's lives, and in particular has upended our transportation system. And so love to hear thoughts on that in the session today. We know COVID-19 has also exposed many of the inequities in our current transportation system, but at the same time has unleashed creative new solutions. We saw emissions fall dramatically as travel slowed, but we're already seeing the signs of increased traffic and congestion. And for me, this really underscores the importance of us not just focusing on greenhouse gas emissions when we talk about the transportation sector, but also thinking about congestion, mobility, livable neighborhoods. So I hope all of that is part of our conversation today and in the coming sessions. I want to thank our partners who helped us get to this point in developing the strategy. So our technical team is led by the Integral Group. And then on the transportation side in particular, they're supported by Nelson Nygaard, who actually developed the transportation model that you'll see today. Also on the team is Waste Zero, Capital Sustainability, and the Institute for Market Transformation. And then just as critically, I want to thank some of our community partners, Empower DC, DC Solar United Neighbors, and the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, who all invited us to join conversations they held this spring and summer with residents, where we were able to discuss the carbon neutrality strategy. And those conversations really shaped the discussions we're going to have with you all, and also reaffirmed our commitment to advancing racial equity through our carbon neutrality strategy. And then finally, I want to thank our sister agencies, in particular, the District Department of Transportation, who were very fortunate to partner on a number of fronts, from electric vehicle planning to developing Move DC, DDOT's plan, and more. And so thank you all again for joining, and I'm going to kick it back over to Jen.
Great, thanks, Kate. So we have a lot to cover today, but we'll start with why carbon and why now, why we're doing this work. We'll define carbon neutrality so we know where we're going, and start to imagine what 2050 could look like, particularly for the transportation sector. Then I'll go through a little bit of the modeling and pathways that we get to 2050, and we'll end with what's coming up on particular discussions around transportation, and we'll have plenty of time again for questions and answers, but please don't feel that you need to hold your questions to the end. Type them into the chat as we go, and we will be keeping track of those. So to get us started, why carbon? The district is feeling the effects of climate change already, and we expect it's only going to get warmer, wetter, and wilder in the future. We're expecting not only warmer average temperatures, but also longer, hotter, more frequent heat waves, more frequent and intense heavy rainstorms like the one we just had like 10 days ago, and higher tides as a result of rising sea levels. We know that climate change is fueled by the concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, and so long as we are above net zero emissions as a city, we are contributing to the climate crisis. So knowing that, the district committed to taking responsibility for our contribution to climate change. And Mayor Bowser pledged to make the district carbon neutral and climate resilient by 2050. We do know that carbon neutrality is a target and not a vision, so we're really working to make sure we don't lose sight of the vision part. We think that tackling climate change is part and parcel of a broader commitment to uphold the values of health, opportunity, prosperity, and equity for all district residents, And these are the values that will guide our carbon neutrality strategy forward. If recent events have taught us anything, it also is the importance of adaptation and resilience, the effectiveness of science-based decision-making, and really the urgency of addressing the racial inequities that are at the heart of our city's biggest challenges. So with that, we're working to root the strategy in community values and priorities and really find the links between those goals and a zero carbon future. So a little orientation to where we are today before we can talk about where we're going. Citywide, the district contributes more than 7.5 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent into the atmosphere every year. The energy that we use in our buildings to heat, cool, power them is the largest driver of those emissions, but transportation is the next largest sector, and that's largely driven by passenger vehicle emissions. The transportation emissions here, the 22%, also includes anything driving on district roads, and also the electricity that we use for the metro system, the DC streetcar, the electric circulator buses, it's all captured there. And the smallest shares, not to leave them out, is waste and wastewater. That is the emissions from both disposing of all the waste that we generate as a city and treating water effluently. But by and large, our emissions are driven by energy use. And so most of the strategies to get us to net zero carbon really target our usage of energy and where that energy comes from. So zooming out to progress to date, the district's emissions have shrunk 27% since 2006, which is our baseline here. That is largely due to moving off of coal-fired power plants at the grid level. We have a long way to go before we reach our 2032 goal of halving our emissions, and an even longer path forward to 2050. Those familiar with our Clean Energy DC plan will know that that plan charts our path to 2032. And so this work now is to figure out how we get all the way to 2050. We are super lucky, though, that we're not starting from scratch. We have a host of other work to build and expand upon, including the Sustainable DC 2.0 plan, and perhaps most importantly, Move DC, which our colleagues at DDOT are working to update over this next year as well. That's where we are today. I want to go ahead and define carbon neutrality so that we know where we're headed. So becoming carbon neutral or net zero carbon means that, like balancing a scale, every year the emissions that the city produces are equal to the emissions that we're able to capture locally or offset. So it's like coming out to zero on a balance sheet, and it's an absolute target, which is different than our Clean Energy DC target, where we always talk about reductions from a baseline. Every city has to decide their own approach to how we'll become carbon neutral. And ours really is to reduce as much as possible the emissions that we produce as a city. So that's from transportation, buildings and energy, and also waste. We'll start with efficiency first, to use less and waste less, and then move to renewable energy. And offsets are always the last piece of the pie there. A transportation example, which I've been using regardless of who I'm talking to, but feels pretty appropriate this morning, is that the first step is we'd want to move more people and more things around the city using less fuel. So that could be strategies that shift more trips to biking, to walking, transit, carpooling. The second step would be that the vehicles that we are using are electric. And the third step is that the electricity that we use to charge those vehicles would come from clean and renewable sources. Ideally, that would come from local sources first, but then a clean regional grid. And then, as always, the fourth step is carbon offsets. Before we move to the technical modeling, though, I think one of the most exciting things to think about in this work is what 2050 could look like if we achieved carbon neutrality and our other visions. So as Kate noted, we're trying to take a different approach to climate planning this go around. And that really starts with a community vision for 2050. From the work that we did in Sustainable DC 2.0 and the recent focus groups that Kate alluded to, we've started to pull out some of the themes of what residents say they want the city to look like in 2050. These are just a start. We plan to do a lot more work to hear from residents, but the goal here is for us to see how a transition to a carbon-free future can really help advance these visions for where we want to be. So the ones that I think are particularly related to transportation includes housing. So not only that everyone has a home in 2050 and can afford to live here, but that home is quality, safe, and in a vibrant and walkable neighborhood. We've heard a lot about health equity, that your zip code is not determined by, your health outcome is not determined by your zip code. And of course, a lot about transportation, that we want safe, convenient, reliable, accessible options, but in particular, let those options serve residents living in all neighborhoods who need to travel on all kinds of schedules and with all incomes. We've also heard a lot about opportunity, the need for a green economy to benefit all residents and for all jobs to pay fair and livable wages, and for residents to be prepared with the tools that they need to live sustainably in the face of a changing climate. So thinking about what 2050 could look and feel like a little bit with this vision, I'll move through the homes part quickly to get to the transportation, but in 2050, we've made sure all district residents have a place to call home that's healthy, safe, and comfortable. That's because as we've built new and renovated existing, we've improved the quality of construction to make them more efficient, more affordable. They're more comfortable and quieter and less costly to keep cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and they run on clean energy. But where that home is located is the exciting part for the transportation sector. So zooming out to our neighborhoods in 2050, we think most residents will be able to walk, roll, bike, take transit to do most things. And that when you do board a bus or get into a vehicle, it will be quiet, clean, and electric. That means we'll see safe and accessible streets, so things that make streets safer for pedestrians and cyclists, like better signals or longer crossing times, slower speeds, protected space for cyclists and pedestrians with more space that make the outdoors enjoyable. And we think the outdoors will be a little more enjoyable because we'll be breathing cleaner air. With electric cars and buses, fewer idling vehicles, and no fossil fuel use in our buildings, we should be able to breathe easier as we enjoy that outdoor space. Finally, zooming out to our region, we really can't do this alone, especially for the transportation sector. And so in addition to thinking how we move people differently and shifting that within the city, we also are envisioning a regional transformation. And that could be something like faster commute times because of a couple of reasons. One is that we'd like to enable people to live closer to where they work. We envision a robust regional transit system where Metro Rail and Metro Bus are a huge part of making people's commutes easier, more affordable, and safe. And we also envision workplace flexibility to telework like we are now, commuting at off-peak hours, and things that may cut down on congestion and save valuable space and time for those who need to travel. So I find it's really fun to think about the future and what we'd like to see in 30 years. And it's really helpful to imagine before we dive into the modeling. But with that, here's the model. So we modeled 3 pathways. The gray line is the trajectory that we are currently on. This is us implementing all the pieces of the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act for those who are familiar. It's a lot on the building side, but the transportation portion that's relevant is really around electrification of fleet. The mix of policies in that scenario gets us to about a 63% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And so that meets and slightly exceeds our Clean Energy DC goal. The other two scenarios are the paths to carbon neutrality, and you'll see that they get us to the same place. That's an 89% reduction from where we started. But really the pace at which we see the change is different. The green line is a much more gradual glide path, and the orange line is essentially the same mix of policies, but accelerating their timelines. The accelerated scenario gets us to about an 81% reduction by 2032, so it's just a much steeper decline. But why does the trajectory matter? Again, both reduction scenarios get to the same place, but the difference in how quickly we're able to bend that curve has implications for how much emissions in total the city has contributed to the global atmosphere. That's really what the planet cares about, how much in total we're emitting. And so you can see the savings here from accelerated action. Studies suggest globally that cities like the district really need to start taking action seriously and now. And so that we should be aiming for more like an 80% reduction by 2032. So that's really the pathway that the accelerated scenario outlines and what could be possible if we started now. So I will go through the transportation model a little more specifically, but just wanted to snapshot how it fits into our larger path to neutrality and the importance of the things we've already got underway, but also the need to do more. As we go throughout the strategy planning, we are working to come up with a list of milestones to help us understand if we're on track. The milestones come from a couple different places. Many of you might recognize this 75% of commute trips without a car from Move DC and Sustainable DC. Some of them come from previous plans, and some of them we've calculated backwards from where we need to be in 2050 based on the lifespan of an average bus or car. So I'll talk about those further as we go, but that's ultimately where we're trying to get. So transportation. Again, the goal here is to move more people, more goods around the city in safe, clean, efficient ways. Again, transportation here is such a regional issue probably in most metropolitan areas, but that really does present some unique challenges as we work to reduce our emissions. So again, transportation currently is 22% of our emissions citywide, and that's really largely from passenger vehicles. Within that, from passenger vehicles that are privately owned. That information really helped to inform our approach for transportation, which is prioritizing shifting more trips to active and public transit, walking, biking. That started with Sustainable DC and Move DC, and we think it's a really good fit for us because it reduces our roadway congestion at the same time that we're cutting carbon pollution. So the transportation modeling that went into this chart looks at on-road travel, as well as passenger rail and metro, but really the biggest opportunity there is decreasing our dependency on single occupancy gas and diesel vehicles. We use the regional growth projections for the region and work from there to see how traffic on our roads will look different by 2050, both in what's driving on our road and what fuel they're using. We then adjusted the two pathways to neutrality to look first at the impacts of shifting trips to non-vehicle travel or non-single occupancy vehicle travel, and then secondarily to look at electrification. Both scenarios, the gradual and the accelerated, use the same mix of actions. It's just the accelerated one ramps up more quickly. That's both in front-loading investment in transit and other improvements that get more people out of cars and accelerating private electric vehicle adoption, so speeding that up by about 5 years. Again, the modeling is telling us that we've got to shift first and electrify second, and that's in line with our goals from the past decade or so. So for the transportation sector, again, we're really looking at driving towards commute trips being made in something other than a car, and then keeping track of how much total driving is happening within the city and in what type of vehicle. To give you a sense of what goes in, how we could get there, the team from Nelson Nygaard used guidance from the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association on reducing emissions. This really helps us look at how policies work together because they're so interrelated. But essentially, they were looking at strategies around a number of things. So under land use changes, this includes things like high density housing and higher density commercial nodes, which also help us have shorter trips between different types of services, maybe reducing the distance between work and home. That could help us also increase walking and biking. Neighborhood enhancements, this could be things like improved streetscape, better walkability and bikeability that we envisioned in our 2050 neighborhood. The commute trip reduction, this is really all aimed at shifting away from single occupancy vehicles because those are the most emissions and space intensive commute modes. So things like this could be employer subsidized transit passes. If we've heard about fare-free transit, that would fit into this category as well. Under road pricing and management and parking, this would be things like off-peak freight delivery, freight signals, congestion pricing, also how we approach parking and how much we require in the city and how that parking is priced. Ooh, tongue twister. Finally, transit improvements are things that enhance the frequency, reliability, and connectivity of our transit system. So things like expanded night or weekend service, universal fare systems, and transit priority all fit into that bucket. So we looked at those all together and how they work together, and then finally applied some strategies around reducing emissions from those vehicles, which is really the uptake of electric vehicles. That includes increasing access to electric vehicles, but also to charging. And it does include the clean energy DC goals around fleet electrification. So there's a lot we can and need to do. Here are some of the examples that I talked about, and we really hope that this will be where we spend a lot of time starting this Thursday, hearing from you all about what mix of policies we need in the district and what makes sense. Next Thursday, we'll have a conversation more about the electrification side. And as DDOT updates Move DC, we'll be sharing information back and forth with that team and ideas back and forth with that team so that we're all on the same page. Here at DOEE, actually on the electrification side, we're also beginning work on a transportation electrification roadmap for how we meet our clean energy DC goals on the electrification side. So I think all three teams are working together to hear your ideas and see where we can slot them in and share them across so that you don't have to attend every meeting that all three teams have. So there are a lot of things that we can do to get us on the path to neutrality and that we must do. But I did want to just note that even with the strategies that we've outlined, we don't get to zero. In 2050, even with all the strategies across all the sectors, we will have about 1 million metric tons of emissions left in 2050 per year. And so on the transportation side, the reasons for that are twofold. One is that we don't assume everything driving on our roads will be electric by 2050. We don't have that kind of control, and there is still a little bit of uncertainty about the timeline for heavy-duty vehicles in particular. The second factor is that our grid won't be 100% renewable by then, and until that's true, even our electric vehicles won't be truly zero carbon. So those are the initial technical findings. I just wanted to circle back to the other values that we have. I think they're really important for all the sectors, but particularly transportation. So again, we're really trying to start with a community vision for 2050. And knowing what must change in order for us to reach neutrality, we're really looking to see how we can craft solutions that solve our carbon and our other challenges like health, air quality, safety, connectivity. This is really just back to making sure that we're starting with these values in the middle and looking at ways of solving them through a necessitated transition to a zero carbon future. So one way of doing that is just as we're evaluating policies on their carbon potential, we'd like to use the community and resilience values as criteria on which to evaluate potential policies. The goal is really to see how we can make improvements in these areas, but as a backstop, at least make sure we're not making anything worse. So the final policy roadmap could look something like this, just allowing us to look at all of the factors that we really care about on one playing field. And ultimately, our goal is to be able to start with the community vision and tie our policies back to how it helps support that. This is the real test for us, and we really need to be able to trace through how our policies support the community vision and where the gaps are that we might need policy or programs for to make them true. So again, we pretty much know what we have to do, where our sources of emissions are, but it's really the how we do it that we're super eager to get your thoughts and ideas on. So we are hosting an initial series of focused discussions around a couple of topics to get us started. Mobility and mode shift is our first one on Thursday. And we hope that if you haven't yet, you'll be able to register and join us for one or both of those conversations. We'll also be sharing a feedback form online soon if you'd like to provide additional thoughts, feedback, comments. It's not live yet, but when it is, we'll put it on our website and we'll send it out as well. So that was a lot. I really thank everyone for taking that journey with us and letting us share what we've done so far. I'd love to open the question and answer session now. So please, if you haven't yet, go ahead and type your questions into the chat and Kate will get us started and answer them. And again, if we're not able to get to all the questions, we'll post an FAQ on our website with the ones that we didn't get to.
So Jen, we don't have any questions in the chat, but I'll give folks a minute to type in their questions. And also if anyone's having trouble with the chat, I think you can also raise your hand. There's a little hand icon on the right-hand side. I'll start with just a general question for you to kick it off. I think it was a theme that came up in our buildings overview yesterday. But what are the biggest challenges we face when it comes to reducing emissions from the transportation sector? You touched on a few of them, but what are sort of the must-haves that we need to do in your perspective and based on the modeling?
Okay. I think the really big nut for us to crack is how can we move people more efficiently using less fuel? And so what are all the mix of strategies that we need to get us taking transit, walking, biking more? And a lot of those have to do with not just the services that we have available, but everything from what your neighborhood looks like when you walk out your door and how easy things are to access. I think it's the toughest nut to crack because there's so many things at play there. But we've really seen that that is far and away the biggest hurdles first, because if in order to electrify what's left and to ensure that people have, we'd like to reduce traffic. I think all of us are maybe not missing traffic as much anymore when we're able to telecommute. If we electrify first, we are all just going to be sitting in more traffic in our clean, quiet electric vehicles, and that's really not the goal. So I think starting with the transit and mobility first, which is a principle we've laid out since the beginning, really is the main crux of the solution for us. And we love it because not only for the congestion benefits, but it really should make the city much more feel different as you get around, and hopefully will be a much nicer environment to be in as our air gets cleaner and we have less noise from the transportation sector on the road as well.
Great, thanks, Jen. We have a couple questions from Sean. The first is, what is the level of coordination with transit providers like WMATA to help meet these goals?
Great question. We're talking to WMATA all the time, so is DDOT. I think, as WMATA often likes to say, they are happy to help us do whatever we and the other states fund them to do. And so I think this is really helpful for us to think through what we need in the city from our transit system and figure out what WMATA's share is in making that happen. One thing I know WMATA is looking at right now is a late night service study. And so some of those things really intersect with some of the improvements that we know we need to see. That's part and parcel of making sure that we're serving all neighborhoods at all different times. That late night surge shift is really a gap that they've identified and that we think is super important for us in the city. So that's just one example, but I think we're all in this together and we all recognize that, and we're glad to have them as a partner.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think it's really important to note how much of a good starting place we have in achieving carbon neutrality because of Metro, both rail and bus, but especially Metro Rail. I think when Jen showed the pie chart at the beginning of the presentation about our share of emissions, not a lot of cities have the same breakdown of transportation and buildings emissions, with transportation being a smaller piece of the pie. And that's really due to the success of Metro in reducing the amount of travel in single occupancy vehicles. So we know that's, a legacy we have to not only maintain, but build on if we're going to meet our goals. I've actually, when the mayor talks about climate change, she talks a lot about Metro and how important it is to enable us to meet our goals. And I'll also note on the sort of regional coordination, in addition to Metro, we work really closely with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, where a lot of these conversations around regional transportation happen. And then we also participate in the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a group of the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast states that have been working for several years now to put together a program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector across the region. And so we can actually share, there's some upcoming webinars from those states that we can pass along with some of the follow-up information. Sean has another really good question, Jen. What strategies will help fill the cost gap between ICE cars, which I believe is internal combustion engine, and electric, especially for low and moderate income communities?
That's a great question. I would also point out these are the types of questions we're hoping to get into in our conversation around electrification next week on the 1st. So if you'd like to talk more about that, would love, those are our opportunity where we hope to sit back and listen and hear from you all what barriers you see and maybe what ideas you have for overcoming them. But not to punt completely. I think the strategies are a few, right? I think we're thinking a lot about access to cleaner cars and what does access mean. For some folks, it might be ownership. For some folks, there's interest in an EV car sharing program. And so I think it is a little bit on us to hear from the community what really their goal is and how their needs would be served by different options, and then figuring out what mix of incentives or programs or availability in their neighborhoods would meet those needs. But I think we are still trying to figure out where folks are at, what people need to get around, and how that plays into it.
So I'm going to pause for a minute and see if we get any other questions coming into the chat. And again, if anyone's having trouble with the chat, please, or it's just joining us by phone, I think you can raise your hand as well. I think this being our third session, we've been able to preempt some of the questions because we realized these were things that we should have answered in the overview. I see John McGregor. I did not see your question. Jen or Sarah, did you see the question from John?
I'm scanning. John, I don't think I see your question. Do you mind resending?
Yeah, I don't see it either.
John, to everyone, if that's one of your options, or you can just send it to the panelists. And it looks like Molly also tried to submit a question and it's not showing up.
If it's easier, we can, Molly, you're at the top of my list and I can just unmute you if you'd like to just ask us your question. And then John, we can do the same. So Molly, you should be unmuted.
Hi. Yeah, I was dropping questions into the chat, so something's not quite working in the system. First of all, would love to see the links from the last slide in the chat because they're not live for the viewer right now, so I can't click on them. Second, would like a definition of mobility and mode shift, please, so I understand what that conversation is about. And third, was interested in how the modeling that you did, what were the assumptions about federal clean car standards and what the auto industry is going to be doing in terms of emissions reductions.
Great, thanks Molly, and sorry that I think every webinar we have a slightly different technical challenge, so this seems to be our one for the day. So thanks everyone for being super patient and forgiving. So Kate has just dropped a link, so that's question 2. First, sorry, I'll go with your third question first and then we'll come back. Oh, mobility and mode shift. So I think really, let's see if I can shift back here. The mobility and mode shift conversation is really all things not electrification. So from these circles, I think it's an opportunity to talk about what mix of policies we might need to help people make different commutes on different modes, how land use plays into that, what kinds of things we need to see from our transit system in order to make people want to ride it or make it convenient for people to ride. And also we could talk about road management and parking. So any and all of those are options. And I think we're hoping to hear from the group kind of what directions we want to go. It won't be the last conversation, I will say. It's just something to kind of get us started. And I think between us and DDOT, we will have many more conversations about where we need to make headway on mobility. And so mode shift, I keep trying to think of a better way to say that. And so if anyone has ideas, that's really just shifting us from single occupancy passenger cars to basically anything else. And modeling assumptions around federal standards, I think was your last question. Great question. So this is the CAFE standards for folks who are familiar for light duty traditional internal combustion engines. So we are assuming that they will continue to improve in fuel efficiency in line with those standards till 2025. And after 2025, we assume that efficiency improvement will follow a historic linear trend. So hopefully that answers your question, but let us know if not.
All right. So we have a few more questions in the queue. One is related to how PEPCO can affect the cost of transportation electrification, namely EV rates for customers. And this is a wonky thing that I will try to define: non-wires alternatives for grid upgrade requirements, which is a way to talk about investing in things other than building new grid distribution infrastructure, but investing in things like storage and energy efficiency and et cetera. But Jen, I'm assuming the answer to this one is these are exactly the types of things we want to tackle in the electrification conversation next week. But anything else you want to say about EV rates now, or do we just want to hold that one for the follow-up?
Yeah, I'm not in a place to speak intelligently about that, so I think that's a great topic of conversation for October 1st for anyone who's able to join. And if not, we'll be posting the notes that we from those discussions, and then we'll have opportunities for folks to weigh in, even if you're not able to make it.
Great. And we have a question from John related to behavioral changes like switching from commuting by car to commuting by metro seem to be harder to change than shifting to an electric vehicle. Have you tried ranking the changes needed by their impact on greenhouse gas emissions reduction, weighted by the difficulty of making the changes? That might help us target and prioritize the changes. I think that's not quite exactly what we were trying to show in your matrix, but I think that does start to get at kind of the magnitude of potential savings. Anything else you want to say there? Maybe we can show that matrix again.
Yeah, I will flip back to it. Again, yes, I think, John, those are some of the questions that we are trying to get to the root of, and I think you're right. I think behavior change across all sectors is a factor and something we're trying to get creative ideas on how we can move forward for sure. I will say that everything is a little bit jumbled right now because of the times that we're in. And so we are seeing, I think that's also an opportunity to think about how our current events might be impacting how folks are thinking about the future as well.
So I am not seeing any other questions in the chat unless we missed any more again. Sarah, have you seen any?
I have not seen any other ones popping up.
Okay, so if anyone sent in a question that we haven't gotten to yet, please try to use the hand raise. Because for some reason your questions might be getting lost in the ether.
Molly, maybe I'm just seeing your hand again, but if I'm going to unmute you in case you actually have another question and we didn't get rid of it. In case that's not a technical error. Molly,
apologies, that was a remnant from before.
Oh, no worries. We just wanted to make sure we didn't miss you.
All right, so maybe Jen, I'll turn it back over to you to close out and we can show folks the schedule again of our additional conversations.
Great. Oops. Well, that's how to reach Kate and me. And again, we'll post these slides later. So the links to the two web pages are in the chat, but we'll also have the slides. You can get a hold of both me and Kate. I think my email is all over all the web pages, so you can find me pretty easily. Here's the schedule again. Just wanted to say thank you for spending a little bit of time this morning with us. We are really excited about thinking 30 years into the future about where we need to be, and the timing is really great with the work at DDOT as well. And I do just want to reiterate thanks to the DDOT team for being so willing to work with us and kind of figure this out together. They're coming from a more transit delivery standpoint, but I think we have all the same shared goals around mobility, around safety, around clean air, and the importance of making our city friendly and accessible to more transit, more walking, more biking, and how we can encourage that. So I did just want to leave everyone with the idea that we will be sharing feedback back and forth, so hoping to make the most of everyone's comments. And again, for anyone who isn't able to make one of our follow-up sessions, this is just the beginning. I know DDOT is kicking off their Move DC effort in the coming weeks, And so there will be many more opportunities to chat about the future of transit and what that looks like, what it should look like, and how we can make our transit system more equitable as we do it. So with that, we just invite you to stay engaged, stay in touch, let us know if you have a burning question that comes to you after the session, you know how to reach us. And we will post the recording, the slides, yes, the recordings and the slides on our website as soon as WebEx makes them available to us. So thanks everyone so much for joining us this morning, and I hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday.